I had been planning that camping trip for months, telling myself that a few days alone in the quiet hills of northern Colorado would clear my head. It was the summer of 2017, and I had just turned 26. I wanted a break from the noise of my life, a break from screens and people and the endless routine of work. I remember feeling excited as I drove up the narrow dirt road that twisted through the hills. The further I went, the fewer signs of life I saw. No houses, no cars, just long stretches of dry grass, scattered pine trees, and the rough shape of the mountains rising ahead. I reached the spot I had picked on the map, a small clearing near a shallow creek. The soil was dry and powdery and smelled like sun-baked earth. I set my tent on a flat patch near a group of boulders. I could hear water running faintly through the creek, and the sound felt calming. The afternoon sun was bright and warm, and everything seemed peaceful. I felt confident that I had chosen the right place. I unpacked slowly, taking my time arranging my gear, checking each item, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything important. I wanted to feel prepared. The first night passed quietly. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the wind pushing through the pine needles outside the tent. The air grew cold fast, sharper than I expected for summer, but I had warm layers. I slept lightly, waking up every hour or so, adjusting my position, then drifting off again. Nothing strange happened, nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual adjustment to being alone in the wild. It was the second day when things began to feel different. I spent the morning hiking along the creek, following it upstream. The water was shallow, barely reaching my ankles when I stepped in to cool off. I noticed animal tracks in the mud, deer, maybe some kind of cat, and something larger I couldn't identify. The prints were wide and heavy, sinking deep into the soft ground. I crouched and studied them, trying to guess what animal they belonged to. After a moment, I shrugged it off and told myself it must have been a bear passing through earlier in the season. But as the day passed, the air started to feel strange. Not dangerous at first, just different. Heavier, quieter. Even the wind sounded thinner, weaker, as if it barely had the strength to move through the branches. I walked back to camp in the late afternoon, my legs aching and my shirt sticking to my back from sweat. I boiled water for a quick meal and sat on a rock eating slowly, letting my body rest. The sun went down behind the hill earlier than I expected, casting long shadows across the clearing. The temperature dropped fast again. By the time night came, the silence felt thicker than before, almost like it was pressing against my ears. I crawled into my tent and zipped the door shut. I lay back, trying to relax, but something in my body stayed tense. It was a quiet, steady alertness that I couldn't explain. I kept shifting my position, rolling to my side, then to my back. I listened to the faint trickle of the creek and the occasional snap of a cold branch settling in the distance. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly, my heart beating too fast. I didn't remember dreaming and didn't know what had triggered it. I just lay still in the dark, trying to breathe slowly. My ears caught something faint outside, something soft, like a slow, deliberate step on dry grass. Then another a few seconds later. The steps were spaced out, almost careful. My stomach tightened as I tried to convince myself it was just an animal passing through. It had to be. This was the wild. Animals moved at night. That was normal. But the steps didn't fade. They circled the area, staying close to the tent's perimeter. They paused at times as if whoever or whatever was out there was trying to listen. I held my breath without meaning to. My heartbeat felt too loud in my chest. Minutes passed, though they felt much longer, before the steps drifted away into the darkness. I waited even after they disappeared, frozen, afraid to move. Eventually, exhaustion pushed me back into a restless sleep. In the morning, the clearing looked the same, but the feeling in my body was different. I felt drained, like I hadn't slept at all. I stepped outside and looked around carefully. The grass around the tent was disturbed, bent in different directions. I checked the ground for tracks, but the soil was too dry to hold clear prints. I kept scanning the trees and the rocks around the clearing, looking for any sign of who had moved around during the night. There was nothing. I tried to shake it off and spent most of the day near the creek, collecting more water and cleaning up my gear. But the feeling of being watched stuck with me. At times I turned around suddenly, certain I had heard something behind me, only to find nothing but trees. When the third night came, the sky turned darker than the previous nights. Thick clouds hid the stars, and the air felt cold enough to sting my hands when I stepped outside to stretch my legs. I checked my tent again and again, making sure everything was zipped and secured. I crawled inside early, wanting to get some rest before the night settled too deeply. It didn't take long before the feeling from the night before returned, only stronger. My body was alert even when my mind tried to relax. I shut my eyes but couldn't fall asleep. I kept listening, waiting. Sometime later, I heard the sound again. A soft, slow step in the grass. Then another. The steps moved closer, following the same pattern as before. There was a cold, heavy pressure in my chest as I realized the movements were deliberate, almost cautious. Not like an animal wandering. Something was choosing where to step. The steps paused right behind my tent. I could hear breathing outside, slow and uneven. My skin felt tight, my hands shaking slightly inside my sleeping bag. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, praying that whoever was out there would move on. Then something brushed the wall of the tent. Just a light touch, but enough to jolt a shock through my entire body. The shape wasn't clear, but I could see a faint outline pressing against the fabric. Tall, motionless. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The outline shifted, then stepped away slowly, moving toward the trees. Eventually, the sound faded again. I knew then that I had to leave. Whatever was out there wasn't just an animal wandering through. It had come back. It had stood close enough to touch the tent. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright, clutching my flashlight, listening for any sound. The hours dragged on, and every minute felt like a test of patience. As soon as the first faint light of dawn touched the sky, I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to move quickly. The clearing felt exposed, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me from the tree line. I kept turning around as I packed, scanning the shadows for movement. When I finally started the long walk back to my car, the weight on my chest slowly eased with each step. The distance between me and the campsite grew, and with it, the fear began to dull. But I didn't stop looking behind me until I reached the road. Only then did I feel like I had fully escaped whatever had been watching me. I drove away without stopping once, not even for water. When I reached town hours later, the relief washed over me so strongly that I had to sit in the car for a while before getting out. I knew then that I would never camp alone again. Not in that area, maybe not anywhere. I still don't know what or who was out there. I don't know what its intentions were. But I know it wasn't my imagination. Something walked around my camp. Something touched my tent. Something stood just a few inches from me in the darkness, silent and patient. And leaving when I did was the only reason I'm able to sit here now, recalling the details clearly. I didn't go back for anything I might have left behind. I didn't report it. I didn't share it with anyone for a long time. I just accepted that sometimes the wild holds things that don't want to be understood. I went out there looking for quiet, but the quiet I found was the kind that watches you from the dark, waits until the world is asleep, then slowly walks right up to your only thin layer of safety. And I know I made the right choice leaving before it decided to do more than just watch. I went to the western edge of the Amazon rainforest in late 2019, a few months after turning 27. I had saved for almost a year to make the trip, thinking I needed a long break from the stale office air and the gray walls I sat between every weekday. I wanted to camp deep inside real wilderness, away from phones, cars, lights, and noise. I kept telling myself I wanted peace, but the truth is that I wanted something that felt real, something that made me feel like my life wasn't just a loop. When I finally arrived in Brazil, everything felt too bright, too hot, and too alive, like the forest itself was watching anyone who stepped near it. I carried a cheap rented backpack, a tent that smelled like another person had used it a few days before me, and enough food for 4 days. My plan was simple. Walk about half a day from a tiny riverside town called Barreiros, set up camp near a narrow stream the locals used, stay 2 nights, and then return before the weather turned bad. I didn't hire a guide because the trail was supposed to be easy enough during the dry season, and I convinced myself that I wanted to feel what it was like to depend on myself. The first day was hot enough to make my shirt stick to my back just minutes after I started walking. The trees grew so tight around the path that the sun only slipped through in thin pieces that flickered on the ground like sharp blades of light. The deeper I went, the more the air felt heavy, filled with the smell of wet soil, rotting leaves, and something sweet that I couldn't place. Sometimes I heard branches crack far off in the distance or birds scream in short bursts. It wasn't peaceful the way I imagined. It felt crowded, like every part of the forest was busy doing something I couldn't see. I reached the stream just before sunset. The water was slow and brown, with thin layers of green plants covering some parts. I chose a dry patch of ground a little way from the bank and set up my tent. The earth there was soft and a strange reddish color. I remember thinking it looked like dried blood, but I pushed the thought away because I didn't want to start my first night making weird connections in my head. The night felt longer than it should have. Every time I tried to sleep, I heard something move, sometimes close, sometimes far, sometimes so soft that it felt like it could have been inside my tent. I kept telling myself it was just animals, maybe small monkeys or rodents. I tried to slow my breathing, but the darkness pressed against the thin tent walls in a way that made it feel like something stood right outside, even when I knew nothing was there. The forest at night doesn't rest. It pulses and shifts, and the sounds blend into one endless noise that never settles. I woke before sunrise the next morning, sweating even though the air was cool. The forest smelled different, sharper, like something had been stirred up. I ate a small breakfast, drank filtered stream water that tasted earthy, and decided to hike a little further into the trees just to explore. I didn't take much with me, just my small knife, a bottle of water, and a cheap flashlight. The more I walked, the quieter the forest became. The birds still called, but the calls seemed far away, like they were avoiding the area I was entering. About an hour in, I noticed the smell first. It came slowly, just a faint sourness in the air. Then it grew thicker, heavier, almost oily. I stopped walking because I recognized that smell from a distance. It was rot, but not plant rot and not dead animal rot. It was sharper, almost metallic, and it made the back of my throat feel tight. I tried to convince myself it was maybe a wild pig that died or some animal carcass left by a bigger predator, but the smell kept pulling me toward its source like a rope. I pushed through a cluster of tall ferns and saw a patch of ground that looked disturbed, like something heavy had been dragged. The earth was scraped and torn, and there were thin streaks of dark brown that had sunk into the soil. My stomach tightened because I already knew those streaks were dried blood. The smell was almost overpowering now, thick enough that I covered my nose with my shirt. A few steps later, I saw it. A body, a man. He was lying on his side, partly hidden under a fallen palm leaf, like someone had tried to cover him quickly. His clothes were torn, and the skin on his arms looked purple and swollen. Flies covered most of him in a buzzing layer. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, and one of his shoes was missing. I felt my knees weaken, and for a moment I thought I would fall. The forest around me felt suddenly still, like even the birds had gone quiet to watch. I stepped back slowly, trying not to breathe too deeply. My first thought was that he had been attacked by an animal, maybe a jaguar or a big snake. But the wounds didn't look like that. They looked messy, uneven, as if made by something not meant for cutting. And then I noticed there were boot prints in the dirt near him, not animal tracks. More than one set, some small, some heavier. They circled the area and then vanished deeper into the forest in a direction I had avoided before. I felt cold even though sweat kept running down my face. Someone or several people had been here recently. The body was not old enough to be calm to look at. It still looked like it had been alive not too long ago. I backed away further, careful not to step on any prints. I didn't know if whoever did this was still around, but the idea of standing there made my heart pound hard enough to hurt. I turned and walked as quietly and quickly as I could back toward my camp. Every time a branch snapped behind me, I thought someone was following. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. When I finally reached my tent, I didn't stop to think. I packed everything fast, barely folding anything, squeezing my gear into the backpack with shaking hands. I kept looking toward the trees, expecting a figure to appear at any second. My plan to stay 2 nights was gone. All I could think about was getting out before someone or something found me. But the forest seemed different now, like the paths had shifted overnight. The trees looked tighter and closer. I tried to follow the same trail I had come in on, but the markers I had made, small scratches on certain tree trunks, were harder to find. The forest swallowed things fast, and it felt like it was swallowing me too. After almost 2 hours of fast walking, I noticed new footprints on the trail. Fresh ones. The edges were sharp. Some overlapped mine from the previous day. They weren't from me this morning. My boots had a different tread. These were wider, heavier, made by someone who had walked this way recently. My chest tightened again, and I felt a panic rise that I couldn't swallow back down. I kept moving. The air felt hotter. My backpack dug into my shoulders. The noises around me grew louder and more chaotic, but they didn't sound like animals anymore. They sounded like movement, human movement, echoing in the trees. I didn't look back because I didn't want to see anything behind me. When I finally reached the river near Barreros, the relief almost knocked me over. The water looked muddy but familiar, and the trees opened enough to let sunlight fall on me like a spotlight. I kept walking until I reached the first human structure I had seen in 2 days, a small wooden dock. I didn't stop until I had walked far past the edge of the forest itself, as far as my legs could take me. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I didn't go to the local authorities because part of me didn't know who was connected to who, or if the people who left those prints had someone watching in the town. I didn't want to explain how I wandered alone in a place where everyone told me not to go without help. I didn't want to be pulled into something I didn't understand. I packed my things that same evening and left the area the next morning. For weeks afterward, I kept waking up at night thinking I smelled the same sharp rot from the forest. And every time I thought about the man lying in the dirt with his eyes open, I felt a twist in my stomach. Someone had left him there on purpose. Someone had walked around him, stood over him, and then walked deeper into the trees like nothing happened. The ending is clear now in my mind. I know for certain that if I had walked a little farther that morning, if I had followed those prints by accident, or if I had stayed even one more night in that same spot by the stream, I might not have walked out at all. The forest didn't scare me. What scared me were the people inside it. And the only reason I'm alive is because I turned back when I did. It was the spring of 2019 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the Peak District. I had turned 27 a few months before, and after a long winter in Manchester, I craved the silence of the moors, the smell of wet earth, and the chance to be alone with my thoughts. I had driven up in an old, battered hatchback, the kind that rattled whenever I hit anything over 30 miles per hour. I had a small tent, a sleeping bag that barely reached my shoulders when I curled up, a thermos of tea, a few cans of beans, and enough water to last 2 days. Nothing fancy, but it was enough. I arrived mid-afternoon. The sun was still warm enough to make the air feel pleasant against my skin, but the wind carried the early bite of spring. I chose a spot not too far from a well-trodden path, but hidden enough behind a ridge to feel isolated. A stream ran a short distance away, and the ground was soft with moss and spring grass. I pitched my tent with practiced ease, hammering the stakes into the damp soil, and set up a small fire pit a few feet away. The first evening was serene. I boiled water for tea over a small camping stove, listened to the trickle of the stream, and watched as the sky bled from orange to dark purple. As the light faded, the sounds of birds became faint, replaced by the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I liked this part the most, the way the world seemed to shrink down to the crackle of my fire and the whisper of the wind. It was just after 8 when I first noticed him. At first, I didn't really notice him, more like a flicker at the edge of my vision. He was standing on the ridge, half hidden by the gorse and brambles, and he didn't move like someone hiking or passing through. He just stood there, staring in my direction. I froze, thinking maybe it was my imagination. The light was fading fast, and the human eye plays tricks at dusk. But when I looked again, he was still there. A tall man, thin, wearing a dark coat that seemed to swallow him whole, with a hat pulled low over his face. His posture was rigid, almost deliberate, and I felt, without knowing why, a deep sense of unease. I tried to focus on other things, telling myself it was nothing, probably a shepherd or a walker. I cooked a small meal and ate quickly, throwing glances over my shoulder toward the ridge. The man didn't move. He didn't walk away. He just stood there, watching. By the time night fully fell, I had finished my tea, brushed my teeth, and crawled into my sleeping bag, leaving the fire as a small circle of light behind me. I didn't sleep well. Every rustle of leaves made me tense. Every distant hoot of an owl felt too close. Around midnight, I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The ridge was empty. I exhaled, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had settled into my chest. I told myself I would see the man in the morning and he would probably just be a lost hiker or someone camping nearby. The next morning was chilly and damp. The ground was wet with dew, and the fire had gone out. I packed slowly, feeling the heaviness of the previous night, and considered leaving entirely. But pride, stubbornness, or curiosity, I still can't say which, made me stay a little longer. I wandered the stream, taking photos of the blooming wildflowers and mossy rocks, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. It was late morning when I saw him again. Not on the ridge this time, but moving along the path that ran parallel to the stream. His pace was slow, almost aimless, yet he seemed to know exactly where I was. I ducked behind a boulder and watched him, heart hammering in my chest. He carried nothing that I could see, no backpack, no stick. Just a dark figure moving with unnerving calm. When he reached the stream, he paused, looked directly at where I hid, and I swear, I could feel his eyes on me even when he turned away. Panic settled in, cold and sharp. I decided to leave. I hurriedly packed my tent, stuffed everything into the car, and kept my eyes fixed on the path, scanning for any sign of him. I drove slowly at first, cautious of the narrow dirt track, but the man never appeared in the car park or along the main path. Relief began to creep in, but it was faint, almost reluctant. I told myself it was over, that I had imagined it, or that he was just someone out for a long walk, maybe a bit odd. But that night, as I tried to sleep in a small bed in a cheap inn in Edale, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept hearing footsteps outside the window, faint at first, then closer. I would sit up, heart racing, only to see darkness. The inn owner laughed it off when I asked if anyone strange had been around the campsite. "Nothing unusual this time of year," he said. "You've been out in the wild too long. Mind plays tricks." I tried to push it out of my mind, but something told me he wasn't imaginary. The next day, on my way back to Manchester, I stopped at a petrol station and grabbed a coffee. While I waited for it, I glanced at the road behind me and saw the same figure, standing on the hill at the edge of the field next to the motorway. My stomach dropped. This time, he was closer than before, and even at a distance, I felt the same weight of attention, the same deliberate stillness. I drove off quickly, refusing to look back. I called the police when I got home, trying to explain what I had seen, but they were polite and dismissive. "Could be anyone," they said. "Unless he's actually harmed someone, we can't do much." Their words were hollow, but at least I knew I wasn't entirely alone in reality. There were protocols, records, evidence. I never went camping alone in the peaks again. I avoided remote paths, abandoned my solo trips, and even walking alone in Manchester at night felt different. I did check local news periodically, hoping to see a report of someone fitting his description being arrested or at least spotted, but nothing ever came up. Looking back now, I understand what terrified me most wasn't just that he was there or that he followed me. It was that he was completely calm. No rush, no panic, no emotion beyond intent. People in distress make noise, draw attention. But this man, he just existed, in the quiet, watching, waiting. And sometimes, in the back of my mind, I still feel that weight when I'm alone on a quiet street. I can't explain it fully, and maybe I never will. The ending for me was simple: survival. I made it out physically unharmed. I was lucky in that he didn't approach or act violently, but the experience changed me. I carry it with me in small ways: the way I scan horizons, the way I notice figures at the edge of my vision, the way I avoid being alone in unfamiliar places after dark. I don't know who he was or why he watched me, but I know the world is bigger and stranger than we often allow ourselves to admit. And I learned that sometimes fear isn't about what happens to you. It's about the presence of something that sees you and does not care whether you see it. Even now, years later, when I drive through the countryside, I sometimes find myself gripping the wheel a little tighter when a figure appears on a distant hill, wondering if the calm, deliberate stare is still out there, waiting for someone else. It was the summer of 2018, and I had decided to take a solo camping trip in the forests of northern Oregon. I had been camping before, but usually with friends, so the idea of being entirely alone both excited and unnerved me. I was 27 at the time, physically fit and confident in my survival skills, or at least I thought I was. I packed my gear carefully: a tent, sleeping bag, basic cooking supplies, a small first aid kit, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I had mapped the area and chosen a spot near a small river but far enough from any main trail to avoid crowds. The drive up to the campsite was long and quiet. The clouds hung low and heavy, dark gray and threatening rain, but I told myself it would just add to the atmosphere. By the time I parked, the first fat drops had started falling. The air was sharp, smelling of wet pine and damp earth. I carried my backpack a few hundred meters into the clearing I had chosen, a small open area bordered by tall firs and dense underbrush. The river gurgled nearby, its sound oddly comforting against the increasing patter of rain. Setting up my tent in the rain was a slow, methodical process. I had to wring out the fabric I had laid down, secure the stakes in soggy soil, and arrange the rainfly so that water wouldn't pool. By the time I finished, my fingers were stiff and numb, and a thin sheen of rain coated my clothes and hair. I had intended to start a small fire to cook dinner, but the wet would made it impossible. Instead, I settled for cold beans from a can, eaten with a plastic spoon under the tiny cover of my tent's vestibule. The rain continued to fall steadily, a constant drumbeat against the tent. At first, it was soothing, almost hypnotic, but as the night deepened, it became oppressive. The forest seemed alive in ways I couldn't name. Shadows from the tent walls moved strangely with the rain-slicked branches outside. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, the gurgle of the river, felt amplified and deliberate. Sometime around midnight, I woke to a sharp, persistent noise outside. At first, I thought it was just a branch falling from a tree, knocked loose by the wind, but the sound repeated, irregular yet deliberate. Scraping, not a soft rustle, but the harsh, grating sound of something moving through wet foliage. My heart started pounding. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear over the pounding rain. Then I heard it again, closer this time, accompanied by a faint, heavy breathing. I had packed a small knife in my bag, but it was useless against whatever might be outside. My only real protection was my own caution and the thin walls of the tent. I told myself it could be a deer or some other forest animal, but the sound was too heavy, too careful, not random like a wild animal's movements. The scraping continued, circling my tent slowly. I could hear twigs snapping, mud squelching under something heavy, and then silence, broken only by the rain. I debated leaving the tent, crawling out into the storm to confront whatever it was, but I knew that would be foolish. So I stayed put, trying to make myself small, hoping it would go away. Every instinct told me to stay awake, to watch, but exhaustion kept tugging at me, and eventually, I drifted into a restless, fitful sleep. I woke again hours later to a sound that made my stomach drop. Soft, slow footsteps moving through the mud outside my tent. They weren't fast like an animal running, but deliberate, heavy, with purpose. I didn't move, didn't breathe more than necessary, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped just beyond my tent flap. I held the knife in my hand, fingers numb with cold and fear. The rain had slowed to a drizzle now, but the air was thick, suffocating. Then, a loud, wet thud hit the side of the tent, and my heart jumped into my throat. Something was outside, just on the other side of the thin nylon wall. I had no flashlight on me, left it in the vestibule, and no way to see what was there. I could hear wet breathing, shifting weight, and then silence again. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios. A lost hiker, a criminal, a wild animal, maybe even a desperate homeless person taking shelter. I felt trapped. Panic tried to take over, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, calculating my next move. I knew I had to do something. Staying in the tent could be fatal if whoever or whatever was out there decided to test it. I grabbed my small backpack and quietly slipped it over my shoulders. It contained my rain jacket, water, a small amount of food, and my cell phone, which was barely charged. I unzipped the tent slowly, peeking outside. The clearing was empty. Mud was churned up where footprints pressed deep, leading toward the tree line but stopping just at the edge of my vision. Whoever it was had stayed just out of sight, watching me. I didn't wait. I started running through the mud, rain-soaked and slippery, toward where I had parked my car. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. My boots sank into the mud. My clothes were soaked and heavy, but I ran as fast as I could, slipping once and catching myself before hitting the ground. In the distance, I could see the faint glow of my taillights. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest as I scrambled the last few meters and flung open the car door, collapsing inside. I locked the doors and sat there, breathing hard, listening to the forest. Nothing followed me, No sound except the rain and the river. My hands shook as I tried to call someone, anyone, but my signal was weak. I waited in the car, drenched and shivering, until the storm lightened slightly with the coming dawn. When I finally got a signal, I called the local ranger station and explained my situation. They told me they would send a patrol to check the area. A few hours later, a ranger arrived. He drove slowly along the tracks leading to my campsite. What he found made my stomach twist. Deep, heavy footprints in the mud, encircling the tent and disappearing into the dense forest. They weren't animal tracks. They were too large, too purposeful, and carried a weight that made the soil shift unnaturally. There were also drag marks, as though something heavy had been moved just out of sight. The ranger said he had never seen anything like it in his years patrolling the area. I left Oregon that day, feeling a mix of relief and lingering fear. I couldn't explain what had been in those woods that night, and I still can't. But I learned something essential. The forest at night, especially in a storm, is unpredictable and unforgiving. I have camped since then, always with company, always near trails, and never alone in remote areas when the weather turns bad. The images of those heavy footprints and the feeling of being watched in the rain stay with me. A quiet reminder that even familiar places can hold real danger. I never saw whoever or whatever was outside my tent that night. But I know one thing for certain. It was intelligent, it knew I was there, and it could have stopped me. That night taught me respect, caution, and humility. The rain, the mud, the river, the darkness, all of it became a memory I carry like a scar, vivid and undeniable. And every time I hear a heavy footstep in the distance, I remember that night, and I know exactly how it feels to be completely alone, exposed, and unsure if you will make it through. I was 27 when I decided to take a short solo camping trip in the high desert of northern Arizona. It was late September of 2019, and the weather had just started cooling down after the long, dry summer. I had been working long shifts, barely sleeping, barely seeing anyone, and I needed to get away from the noise of everything. I picked an area near an old ranch road that hadn't been used much in years, a place where the nearest town was more than an hour away. I wanted silence, dirt, open sky, and nothing else. I parked my truck at a faded clearing just before sunset and walked around for a while, getting used to the dry air and the way sound carried across the empty land. The place felt open in a strange way, like sound could travel farther than it should. Every small movement made a soft echo. Even my footsteps sounded too loud. I set up my tent on a flat patch of ground between two clusters of short juniper trees. The branches were twisted and old, and some of them scraped together in the breeze. Even with the wind being light, the sound was sharp, like dry bones tapping. I tried to ignore it. I unpacked everything slowly, laying things out neatly. I wanted this trip to feel peaceful. I wanted to feel like I had control of something. By the time the sun dropped, the whole sky had turned orange, and the land stretched out like a giant empty bowl. The temperature fell fast. I lit my small camp stove, heated a simple meal, and sat against my cooler as I ate. There was barely any smell except dust and sagebrush. I kept scanning the open land around me, not because I expected anything to happen, but because the quiet made my mind too active. When the dark fully settled, the air felt even thinner. I crawled into my tent around 10, feeling tired but not sleepy. I had heard plenty of local stories before driving out here. People liked to talk about strange things in the desert, things that moved wrong, things that watched from rocks, things that copied voices. People always said it like they didn't quite believe it themselves, but the idea still stuck to you. I never believed in anything supernatural, but being alone out here made every story feel louder. I turned off my lantern and lay on my back, staring at the faint glow of the mesh above me. The moon wasn't full, so the land outside looked washed out and pale. I tried to slow my breathing. Everything felt normal, just silent. I expected the usual noises of night: crickets, wind, the occasional animal moving, but the quiet stayed heavy. Around sometime past midnight, I finally drifted off. I woke up again because of a sound that didn't fit the normal rhythm of the place. It wasn't an animal stepping on leaves or something brushing the tent. It was something like a person dragging their foot through the dirt. It moved in slow, uneven lines. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but deer didn't usually walk like that. The movement felt like it had intention. It circled wider than an animal would. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. I didn't unzip the tent or turn on my light. I just listened. The steps were faint, but they moved at a steady pace, stopping now and then like whoever or whatever was out there kept pausing to look around. The desert was so open that it was impossible for someone to accidentally wander near me without seeing my truck and tent from far away. Anyone coming this close would have to choose to. The sound faded for a minute. I thought maybe I imagined it. Then I heard something much closer. A soft scraping sound just outside the tent fabric, like someone brushing their fingertips along the surface. Slow, testing. Every muscle in my body tightened. I felt the sound more than I heard it. The fabric moved just slightly. I stayed in the tent, holding my breath, waiting. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to speak or make noise. No sign of an animal. The scraping stopped. The air outside became still again, thick with waiting. I expected footsteps moving away, but nothing followed. The quiet settled back, heavier than before. I forced myself not to open the zipper. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. I didn't want to make any sound at all. I waited for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted in and out of shallow sleep. When the sky finally turned pale in the early morning, I crawled out of the tent. The cold air hit me hard. I scanned the dirt around my campsite. First, I didn't see anything. Then my stomach tightened. About 15 feet from my tent were footprints, human footprints, bare ones. They were narrow and long, not running or walking normally, but dragging slightly like the person wasn't lifting their feet fully off the ground. What bothered me most was the path. The prints didn't come from the direction of the road. They came from farther out in the desert, open land where no one would walk barefoot, especially not at night. The prints circled my tent twice. One set led to the exact spot where I'd heard the scraping. I felt a cold wave run through my chest. The desert was too big and too empty for someone to be wandering around like that. I scanned the horizon again and again, but nothing moved. I wanted to pack up immediately, but part of me needed to know more. I followed the prints a short distance until they faded into an area with harder ground. The direction they went made no sense. Farther into the empty land, away from any roads or ranches. My mind went to the local stories, the ones people laughed about but never fully dismissed. People who moved differently, people who came from nowhere, people who watched. I shook it off. I told myself it was just someone unstable, living rough, maybe hiding out there. That was bad enough. Someone wandering barefoot in the dark, getting that close to my tent, was a real threat, not a story. I packed everything fast. My hands were shaking as I shoved gear into the truck bed. I kept scanning the land, expecting to see someone standing far away, watching. The sun rose higher, lighting the ground in a bright, harsh way that made everything look flat and exposed. I hated how open it felt. I felt like I was being seen even if I wasn't seeing anyone. When I finally started the truck and drove off the clearing, I checked my rearview mirror 3 or 4 times every minute. Part of me expected to see someone running after me, moving strangely, closing the distance too quickly. Nothing appeared. The land stayed empty. After about 40 minutes of driving, I reached the old highway. I should have felt safer, but the tension stayed in my chest until I finally saw signs of town. I pulled into a gas station and parked for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, staring at my arms trembling slightly. Later that afternoon, when I got home, I sat on my apartment floor and thought about everything again. The prints, the way they moved around the tent, the scraping, the direction they came from, the possibility that someone had been watching from the dark before I ever noticed. I kept telling myself it was just a person, someone dangerous, someone living out there and creeping near campsites for reasons I didn't want to understand. It didn't matter what local stories people used to explain it. Reality was bad enough. I didn't need to believe in anything supernatural to feel the fear in my chest. What stayed with me the longest wasn't the sound or the footprints. It was the feeling that whoever was out there didn't make a mistake. They weren't lost. They walked straight to my tent in the middle of the night and stood close enough to touch the fabric. The desert was huge, but they chose me. I never camped alone again after that. And I don't think about skinwalker stories anymore. Not because I believe them, but because the real things out there are worse and they don't need legends to be terrifying. I chose a place in northern Arizona for my late summer camping trip, a stretch of mixed pine and dry brush about 40 miles south of Flagstaff. I had been trying to get away from work stress, and I wanted a quiet few nights alone. I picked a spot that wasn't part of any official campsite. I found it while looking at a map online, an area with a small service road, a faded trail, and no buildings for miles. It felt like the perfect chance to be alone. I was 24 that year, restless, tired, and needing some space. I arrived in the afternoon, the sun still high. The air felt warm and dry, but once I got into the trees, I noticed the deeper smell of dirt and old pine needles. I parked my truck near a rough patch of ground where the soil dipped down, forming a quiet pocket surrounded by tall pines. There were no other cars, no people, not even distant engine sounds. The only thing I heard was the wind moving through the trees, that slow and steady sound that feels calm at first, but becomes more intense once you're fully alone. I unloaded my gear slowly, making sure everything was set up exactly how I liked. I pitched my tent close to a leaning pine tree, one that looked like it had been struck by lightning long ago. I laid out my sleeping bag, checked my water containers, stacked some firewood I had brought from home, and walked around the edge of the clearing. I wanted to know the area before the sun went down. There was a small slope to the east where you could see glimpses of the open desert through the tree gaps, and to the west the forest grew much thicker, almost too thick. The shadows looked dark even in daylight. I cooked a small meal before sunset and took a slow walk around the perimeter once more. That was when I noticed the first detail that bothered me. About 50 yards from my tent, near a fallen log, I saw a patch of ground where the dirt looked fresher than the rest. Everything around it was covered in old needles and dry leaves, but that patch looked disturbed, like something or someone had dug there not long ago. The soil still looked slightly darker, like it had been exposed recently. At first, I didn't think too much of it. Animals dig all the time, but the hole wasn't a natural shape. It had sharper, straighter edges like a shovel had been used. It wasn't big, maybe 2 feet wide, but it was definitely dug by a person. The thought stayed in my mind longer than I wanted. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. The warm daylight turned into sharp evening cold. I lit my fire and sat close to it, listening to the normal forest sounds. I tried to calm myself and not think about the dug-out patch of dirt. I told myself someone had probably camped here before me. That kind of thing happened all the time. But the longer I sat, the more I felt like something wasn't right. It wasn't anything I could hear or see. It was that tight feeling I get sometimes, the one deep in my chest that grows slowly, like a weight pressing down, telling me to stay alert. When the forest got fully dark, the sounds changed. During the day, the trees made a soft rushing sound, but at night everything felt much sharper. Every snap of a twig echoed. Every bit of movement in the brush sounded too close. I tried to sleep around 10, after making sure the fire was mostly out. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, listened to the wind, and tried to settle. Sometime after midnight, I woke up with that same heavy pressure in my chest. I didn't know what had woken me. It wasn't a dream. I hadn't been sleeping long enough for that. My ears felt flooded with the sound of my own breathing, and I lay completely still, waiting for something to stand out. Then I heard footsteps, slow, spaced out, and heavy. Not the quick, light taps of a deer or the skittering of smaller animals. These steps moved with weight, pressing into the ground in a pattern that felt deliberate. One step, then a pause, another step. They were coming from the direction of that disturbed patch of soil. My first instinct was to freeze. I kept my breathing shallow, every muscle tense. I listened carefully. The steps moved closer, stopping every few seconds. I didn't dare sit up. My tent felt thin, like there was nothing between me and whatever was walking outside. I waited. I didn't move an inch. For almost a minute, the steps circled near my tent, slow and faint but unmistakable. I tried to convince myself it was an animal moving strangely, but deep down I knew that wasn't right. These footsteps sounded human. Then they stopped. Completely. The silence hit me so hard it felt louder than the steps. I lay there unmoving, for so long that my muscles began to ache. I didn't know if the person was still standing there outside the tent or had moved away quietly. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first light came through the tent, I finally forced myself to unzip the flap and look outside. My throat felt dry. The cold air rushed in. At first, everything looked normal, and for one brief second, I wondered if I had imagined everything. Then I saw the footprints. They were clear in the soft dirt, right next to my tent, and they weren't mine. They were larger, spaced wider apart, and they circled halfway around my campsite. They stopped about 3 feet from where my head had been while I slept. Seeing those prints made my stomach twist. Whoever had walked around my tent had stood close, far too close. I thought about packing up and leaving immediately, but the morning light gave me a thin layer of confidence. I decided to take a quick look toward the dug-up patch from the day before. When I reached it, I froze again. The hole was different. It was deeper now. Someone had come back during the night and dug more. The soil piled next to it was fresh and damp. I looked around the trees, scanning for movement, my pulse racing hard enough to make me feel dizzy. I didn't see anyone, but the forest felt wrong again. Silent in a heavy, unnatural way. I didn't waste another second. I ran back to my tent, grabbed my gear, and tossed everything into the truck without caring how it landed. My hands shook so badly I dropped my keys in the dirt. When I finally got the engine to start, I didn't look back. I drove down that rough service road faster than I should have, the truck bouncing hard on every rock and hole. When I finally reached the highway, I didn't stop until I was halfway back to Phoenix. Only then did I pull into a gas station and lean over the steering wheel, my whole body buzzing with leftover fear. I never figured out exactly what was buried in that hole, or why someone came back in the middle of the night to dig more. I didn't call the police because I didn't know what I would even report. A hole in the woods, footprints, a feeling that someone had been watching me. But the thing that kept me awake for weeks afterward wasn't the footprints, or the digging, or the idea that someone had been close to my tent. It was the fact that whoever it was never tried to hide. They walked right up to me, knowing I was there, knowing I was alone, and then they just stood in the dark, only a few feet away, like they were waiting. I haven't been camping alone since, and I never will again. It was the summer of 2018, and I was stationed in southern Arizona, along a remote stretch of the US-Mexico border near the Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument. I had just turned 27 and was on my first solo border duty rotation after years as a junior patrol officer. The area was rugged desert, full of jagged rocks, cacti, and arid washes that could hide almost anything. Our team was small, just me and my partner, a guy named Miguel. He had been here before, so he knew the land better than anyone, but even his experience couldn't make the nights feel safer. We had set up a temporary camp on the edge of a dry wash, behind a line of mesquite and ocotillo, the only cover in a place where the desert stretched endlessly in every direction. Our mission was straightforward: observe any illegal crossings, track footprints or vehicles, and report anything suspicious. In reality, it was about survival, moving quietly, staying alert, and never underestimating the quiet of the desert at night. The first day was deceptively calm. The sun blazed overhead, baking the ground and turning our water bottles lukewarm almost instantly. We spent hours scanning the horizon with binoculars, noting deer trails, coyote prints, and the occasional rattlesnake's shed skin. Miguel kept reminding me to stay hydrated and to respect the desert. He said the desert isn't quiet, it just hides its dangers until you're too close. I thought I understood him, but I didn't really. Night fell quickly, a dark blanket broken only by the faint glow of the moon and the distant lights of border towns. I took the first watch while Miguel rested in his tent. Sitting on a jagged rock, rifle across my knees, I felt the cold settle deep into my bones. The desert had a way of making you feel alone, even when you weren't. Every sound seemed amplified. The distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of wind across rocks, the tiny snap of a twig. Around 2 a.m., I heard something that made my stomach tighten. At first, it was subtle, a rustling in the bushes beyond the wash. I froze, trying to pinpoint the sound. Then I noticed faint shadows moving across the slope. Someone was out there. My first thought was smugglers. These crossings weren't unusual, but most people kept to the main trails. Whoever was out here was taking the back way. I stayed still, watching. The figure moved carefully, deliberately, crouched low behind the mesquite. Carried something, maybe a pack, maybe equipment. My pulse raced. I adjusted my rifle, heart hammering, and waited. The figure stopped several times, crouching behind rocks, scanning the area as if checking for danger. Whoever it was, they were experienced, and they had no intention of being seen. Hours passed with tense quiet. I barely breathed, and my fingers were stiff from gripping the rifle. At one point, I thought I heard multiple movements, as if more than one person had joined. My mind raced through every training scenario I had learned, every border operation I had observed. I wanted to move, to call it in, but the figure didn't leave. It was as if it was studying me just as I was studying it. By sunrise, the movement had disappeared. I woke Miguel and we started checking the area. There were no footprints in the sand, just the occasional disturbed rock. No tire tracks, no dropped items, nothing. It was as if the person had vanished into thin air. The experience left a knot of unease in my stomach that I couldn't shake all day. The second night was worse. The temperature dropped sharply, and a thin wind stirred up dust that made the air smell metallic and dry. We reinforced our camp, set up tripwires with cans to alert us to any intruders, and huddled around a small fire. I took the first watch again. At about 1:30 a.m., I heard it, a slow, deliberate crunching sound from the ridge above us. I froze, eyes scanning the shadows. The sound stopped suddenly. My training told me to hold my position. Then, in the faint starlight, I saw a shape. A man, maybe in his 30s, dressed in dark clothing, moving low across the rocks. He paused near our tripwires. I held my breath as one of the cans clinked, but the man didn't flinch. He moved slowly, carefully, almost like he had done this 100 times. I whispered Miguel's name into the radio, but there was no response. The batteries had died. I stayed crouched, watching the man. He set down a pack near a boulder and disappeared over the ridge. My hands shook. The pack contained weapons and several kilos of contraband when we found it at first light. Whoever had been near our camp had been precise, patient, and extremely skilled. They could have walked through our camp unnoticed if we hadn't been vigilant. The next day, we followed faint traces along the ridge, noting disturbed rocks, scuffed dirt, and patches of desert that smelled faintly of fuel. Whoever had been out there was careful but methodical, moving in and out of our observation range like a shadow. I realized then that the desert wasn't just empty space. It was alive with movement, with people who knew it far better than we did. The third night was the most terrifying. A storm had rolled in unexpectedly, wind picking up in violent gusts and rain slapping against my tent. Visibility was nearly zero. We decided to stay inside the tents, but I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I thought I heard movement outside, small footsteps in the mud, a soft dragging sound. I froze. My rifle was across my knees. The sound was deliberate, cautious, testing the boundaries of our camp. I watched through the mesh of my tent. A figure moved in the shadows, carrying a bundle wrapped in plastic. The storm muffled most sounds, but I could see the outline clearly. The person crouched near the embankment, then vanished. By morning, the only sign was a wet footprint in the mud leading toward the ridge. Whoever had been out there had slipped, leaving the smallest trace. By the fourth night, we were exhausted. Our water was low, our bodies sore, and our nerves frayed. We decided to break camp early, moving to a more secure checkpoint nearby. As we packed, I took one last look around the desert. The cacti, the mesquite, the jagged rocks, all seemed calm under the rising sun. But I knew it was a false calm. Out there, in the shadows, there were people moving, hiding, watching. Not ghosts, not myths. Real people with skill, patience, and determination. When we left the area, I felt a mix of relief and lingering tension. The border duty had taught me more than I could have imagined about fear, vigilance, and the weight of being alone in a harsh, unforgiving environment. Looking back, the scariest part wasn't the desert or the storm. It was knowing that someone had been so close, so careful, and yet almost invisible. That knowledge stayed with me long after I returned to base. Even now, years later, I can still feel the cold of that desert night, the crunch of rocks underfoot, and the sense of being watched without knowing when, where, or by whom. The border is alive in ways most people will never understand, and sometimes what's most terrifying isn't what you see. It's what you almost never see at all. I set up my small tent on the edge of a forest clearing somewhere outside a quiet town in northern Minnesota. It was October 2019, and I was 31, tired from a long week of work, and hoping a night alone in the woods would clear my mind. I had camped many times before, but I had never camped alone in this exact area. Still, I felt comfortable enough. The place looked calm when I arrived in the late afternoon. The trees stood tall and thin around the clearing, their bare branches shaking slightly in the wind. The ground was covered with damp brown leaves, and the air smelled like cold soil. I pitched the tent, stretched out my sleeping bag, and placed my backpack near the entrance. Everything felt normal, and I didn't expect anything strange to happen. I noticed the sky starting to darken earlier than usual. Thick clouds crawled across the sky, heavy and uneven, almost like shifting piles of wet ash. Weather apps on my phone had said there might be light rain at night, but nothing serious. I didn't worry much. I liked the sound of rain when I slept. I boiled some water for a simple meal and ate quietly while listening to the wind move through the empty branches. The forest was strangely silent. Not the usual birdsong, not even the soft rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just wind. That stillness made me feel uneasy, but I tried to ignore it. By the time the last bit of daylight faded, a drizzle had already started. I zipped myself into the tent and lay back, letting the sound of the rain hitting the fabric calm me. Felt peaceful at first. The rain was steady but not loud. I closed my eyes, trying to relax, but something in the air felt wrong. It wasn't anything clear or dramatic, just a sense that the woods were holding something back. Like the silence wasn't natural, like something was watching or waiting, though I couldn't say why. The rain grew heavier, and the wind pushed it sideways, making the tent walls shake. I kept listening to the storm, letting my mind wander, until I heard something else mixed with the rain. A faint thud, slow, dull. Not like a branch breaking, not like an animal moving, but something heavier. I lifted my head and stayed still, listening. The rain masked the sound at first, so I wasn't sure if I imagined it. But then I heard it again. A heavy step on wet ground. Far away, maybe 20 or 30 feet from my tent. I felt my chest tighten. It was probably a deer or maybe a big dog from one of the nearby houses. That's what I told myself. But the steps were slow and too deliberate. One step, a pause, another step, a longer pause. I wasn't used to animals moving like that. Usually they walk quickly or run or rustle around in bursts of movement. This sounded like something taking careful steps. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't even sit up. I just stayed still, listening with all my focus. The steps got closer, but not too close. They stayed near the tree line, circling slowly around the clearing. It was like someone or something was walking in an arc around my camp. The rain pounded harder, drowning out bits of the sound, but every few seconds I heard it again, steady and patient. My hands felt cold even inside the sleeping bag. The temperature had dropped fast, and the air felt wetter and heavier. I could hear the steps shifting slightly, like weight settling into mud. I had no weapon with me besides a small camping knife, which was nowhere near enough to make me feel safe. I thought about turning on my flashlight, but I didn't want to show movement or light. I wanted to stay quiet and invisible. Minutes passed, though they felt longer. The steps eventually stopped. Not faded away, just stopped suddenly. That silence felt worse than the sound. I strained my ears, trying to hear breathing or shifting or anything, but there was nothing but rain. The wind pushed water across the tent, making a constant hiss. I waited and waited, wondering if whatever it was had left or was standing still, listening back at me. After a long while, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the storm had warped the sounds. Maybe water dripping from branches made patterns that sounded like footsteps. I tried to calm myself down, but my body stayed tense. I lay there staring at the dark roof of the tent, listening to the rain until my eyes felt heavy. I must have drifted toward sleep without meaning to. I woke up to a loud crack. My heart jumped instantly. It wasn't thunder or a branch breaking in the distance. It was close, as if someone had snapped a thick stick just a few feet from the tent. I sat up silently, every muscle tight. The rain hadn't stopped, but it was lighter now, and I could hear the forest more clearly. I heard breathing, not mine, not an animal's fast panting. Slow, steady breathing, close enough that I could tell it belonged to something standing outside my tent. I didn't dare move. I didn't even blink for a moment. I just listened. The breathing was deep and calm, almost like someone trying not to make noise but failing to hold their breath long enough. I felt the pressure of fear sitting in my throat, almost choking me. Then the shape shifted. I didn't see it, but I heard the faintest brushing sound against the wet leaves. A step, then another. It was right outside the thin wall of fabric, maybe no more than a foot away from me. I could imagine something tall standing there, motionless, watching my tent in the dark. I could feel its presence like a weight pushing down on the air. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever. The rain tapped on the roof. The breathing continued, slow and steady. My own breathing felt too loud, even though I was barely taking in air. My mind raced with possible explanations. Maybe a person, maybe a lost hiker, maybe someone drunk or homeless passing through the woods. But who would stand right next to a stranger's tent at 3 or 4 in the morning? Not saying anything, not moving away. Eventually, the steps moved again. Slow, dragging steps like someone careful not to slip in the mud. They moved away from the tent, back toward the trees, until they blended into the rain. I didn't sleep again. I just sat there in the dark, waiting for the first hint of light. When dawn finally came, the rain had stopped. Everything was wet and cold, but daylight made me feel brave enough to unzip the tent. I stepped out, scanning the clearing. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just soaked leaves and muddy ground. But then I noticed the footprints. They were clear, deep prints left by heavy boots, not animal tracks. They circled the entire clearing in a wide loop, and then a second set came in much closer, right up to my tent. The footprints stopped only a few inches from where my head had been while I slept. I followed them with my eyes and saw that they led back into the trees. They didn't rush or run. They walked out the same slow, careful way they had come. I packed up everything as fast as I could. I didn't even think about eating breakfast. I just wanted to leave. The forest still felt quiet, but now the silence carried a different weight, like it held the memory of whoever had been there. When I finally reached my car and locked the doors, I sat there for a while, shaking. The storm had washed away many tracks in the distance, but the ones near my tent were fresh and deep. Someone had been watching me during the storm. Someone had stood there, breathing and listening while I tried to stay silent. The ending became clear to me as I drove away. That night didn't feel supernatural. It didn't feel like anything from a story meant to scare people with monsters. It felt human. That was what made it worse. A real person had been walking around my tent in the rain, moving slow, watching, waiting for something I never figured out. And the part that stayed with me the most was that they never said a single word. Not one sound besides those slow breaths and careful steps. I never went back to that part of the forest. I still camp, but never alone, and never without thinking about that rainy night in Minnesota. I still picture the footprints circling my tent and the way the breathing sounded just inches away from me. I never learned who it was or what they wanted. All I know is that they were real, and they were there, watching me while I slept in the dark woods with nothing but thin fabric between us. I planned the trip in late September of 2019, a time when the heat in most of the southern states had finally started to fade. I had been working long shifts for months and needed a break from everything: noise, work, people, all of it. I picked a remote area in northern Arizona, far away from the usual crowded campgrounds. I found a place near an old forest road that didn't appear on most maps anymore. A few hikers mentioned that the road still existed but wasn't used much, mostly because it got rough past a certain point and people rarely bothered driving that far. That sounded perfect to me. I wanted silence, open air, and maybe a chance to clear my head. I packed basic gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, a small stove, a foldable table, and enough water for a few days. I left Phoenix early in the morning and drove north until the landscape shifted from hot desert to pine forests. The air got cooler as I climbed in elevation, and by the time I turned onto the old forest road, the sun was already high and the trees were thick enough to block half the sky. The road was bumpy and narrow, just as described. Dirt and stones bounced under the tires, and branches scraped lightly against the truck as I went deeper. After about 40 minutes of slow driving, I found a small clearing to the right of the road. The grass was short and flat, which meant it had likely been used as a campsite sometime in the past. But the lack of any trash or fire pit made it look abandoned for years. I stepped out of the truck, breathed in the pine scent, and felt a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in months. I set up my tent near the tree line where the ground felt the most level. The forest around me was quiet except for a few birds and the faint sound of the wind brushing against branches. I walked around the clearing, checking the area, making sure there were no animal tracks or signs of recent visitors. Everything looked untouched. I felt completely alone, which was exactly what I wanted. I spent the first afternoon collecting scattered pieces of dry wood and stacking them near the fire ring I planned to make later. I ate a simple meal, then sat in a chair and watched the sunlight fade through the trees. The temperature dropped fast when it got dark. The air was cool but not freezing, and a soft breeze drifted through the clearing. I eventually crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to fall asleep. Sometime in the early hours of the night, I woke up to a faint sound. It was hard to tell what it was because I was still half asleep. At first, it seemed like something brushing against the outside of the tent. I stayed still and listened. The noise came again, light, slow, irregular. It wasn't the wind, at least not the kind I was used to hearing. The pattern felt too uneven, like something taking cautious steps. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. Animals moved through forests all the time. I stayed still, waited, and eventually the sound faded. After a while, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out and walked around the tent. I didn't see any tracks, at least none that I could easily identify. The ground was covered in a mix of pine needles and dirt, which made it hard to spot footprints unless they were deep or obvious. I brushed it off and made breakfast. The air was colder than the day before, and thin clouds drifted across the sky. I decided to explore the surrounding area. The forest road continued uphill, so I followed it for a while. The trees got denser and the path grew narrower. After about half a mile, I found an old scattering of rusted metal parts, maybe an old abandoned truck or equipment. It looked like it had been there for decades. I didn't stay long because the air felt strangely still in that spot, like everything was holding its breath. When I got back to camp, the clearing looked calm and undisturbed. I spent the day relaxing, writing in a small notebook I brought with me, and heating a simple meal as the sun dropped again. The evening sky had deeper colors, dark orange fading into purple. I made a small fire and sat near it until it burned low. When I finally lay inside the tent again, the cold felt sharper. I curled deeper into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes. It must have been well past midnight when I woke up again. This time, the sound wasn't soft. Something snapped a branch nearby. Clean, loud crack. My eyes opened immediately. I stayed frozen for a few seconds, listening. The silence afterward was tense, heavy, like the forest was waiting for something. Then came another sound, slow steps on dry needles, somewhere near the edge of the clearing. I could tell by the spacing that it wasn't a small animal. These steps were heavier, deliberate, and measured. I didn't move or make a sound. My breathing felt loud inside the sleeping bag. The steps grew closer, then stopped. The quiet after that felt even worse. I stayed awake, listening to nothing but the silence that followed. I didn't sleep again until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside and checked the clearing more carefully. This time I saw something, about 15 feet from my tent. Near a patch of dirt where the needles were sparse, were footprints. Human footprints, barefoot. The prints were clear and deep enough to tell that whoever made them had stood there for a while. I stared at them for a long time, unable to understand why someone would be walking barefoot in the cold forest in the middle of the night. I didn't see prints leading in or out, at least none that I could follow. The ground was too uneven to track anything far. A wave of unease stayed with me all day. I kept glancing around the trees, scanning shadows, checking the edges of the clearing. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like it was watching me. I debated packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to run just because of a few footprints. I tried to calm myself by focusing on simple tasks, organizing gear, boiling water, cleaning the small pot. The routine helped a little, but every time the wind moved the trees, I tensed up. When night came again, the fear I tried to ignore returned. I double-checked the tent zipper and kept a flashlight close to my chest. I tried to sleep, but the silence was too heavy, and the forest felt too alert. Hours passed slowly, and I drifted in and out of shallow rest. Somewhere deep in the night, the steps came back. Slow at first, then stopping near the same spot as before. I didn't breathe. My heartbeat felt like it shook the tent. I could hear something standing still outside for a long time. Then, very faintly, came a soft exhale, not mine. A human breath. I stayed frozen until sunrise. When the sky lightened and the forest warmed, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. I walked straight to the spot where the prints had been. Fresh ones were there. Same size, same barefoot shape. The prints pointed toward my tent this time, as if whoever stood there had been facing me directly. My hands shook as I packed everything. I didn't bother eating breakfast. I threw my gear into the truck as fast as I could, started the engine, and drove without looking back. The trees rushed past on both sides as I followed the rough forest road back toward civilization. The farther I got from that clearing, the easier it became to breathe again. When I reached the main road, I finally stopped the truck and stepped out for a moment. The morning sun was warm, and the air smelled nothing like the cold pine forest I had left behind. I stood there, trying to understand what had happened. There was nothing supernatural about it. No ghost story. No strange creature. Just a person out there, barefoot in the woods at night, creeping close to my tent without making a sound. Not once but twice. Someone who didn't say anything, didn't reveal themselves, and didn't leave any clear tracks except the ones that showed how close they had been standing to me. That thought stayed with me longer than fear of any animal or story ever could. Because whoever it was, they weren't lost. They weren't confused. They had come close on purpose. I drove home with a tight feeling in my chest, knowing I would never camp alone in a remote place again. And the worst part was that nothing dramatic happened, nothing violent, nothing that would leave a scar or a wound. The only thing that stayed with me was the simple, cold truth. Someone had watched me in the dark, studied my camp, and stood only a few steps from where I slept, barefoot and silent. They didn't take anything. They didn't touch anything. They just came, watched, and left. And knowing that was more than enough to make me never return to that forest road for the rest of my life. I was 31 when I decided to take a short break from my job in late September of 2019. I had been working long hours for months, and my head felt heavy every day. I needed quiet, open space, just a place where nothing moved except wind and time. That was why I chose a small, old farm on the outskirts of a tiny village in southern Poland. It wasn't a popular vacation spot. Most people didn't even know it existed. That was the reason I picked it. The farm sat several kilometers away from the nearest paved road. The owner allowed campers to stay on the property as long as they respected the land and didn't go near the storage barns. The fields around the farm were wide and flat, with tall grass that brushed against my knees when I walked through it. There were patches of forest around the edges, but most of the land was open, quiet, and a little too still. I liked that. I wanted that. When I arrived, the sun was low in the sky. The light was warm and soft, stretching long shadows over the fields. I set up my tent far from the main house, close to a broken wooden fence that hadn't been repaired in years. The boards leaned in different directions, like they were tired of standing up. A dry smell hung in the air, mixed with soil and cut hay. I felt calm there, like the land was holding its breath, giving me space. The first night passed without anything strange. I cooked a small meal, walked around the field, and watched the sky turn dark. The stars were clear and sharp, like someone had cleaned the whole sky for me. I slept easily, maybe too easily. The next day, I decided to walk deeper into the property to explore the older areas of the farm. I found rusted tools half buried in dirt, broken wooden crates, tire tracks that led to nowhere, and a pile of stones that looked like someone had once tried to build something but gave up halfway through. Everything felt abandoned but not forgotten. It was the kind of place that carried memories in the ground, even if no one talked about them anymore. Later that afternoon, while walking near the tree line, I found something odd. The grass there was pressed down in a wide circular shape, like something heavy had been resting on it. The center of the flattened grass was darker, damp for some reason, even though it hadn't rained for days. Next to it, the ground was disturbed, as if someone had been dragging something long and uneven. At first I thought maybe it was a machine that had been moved, or maybe some kind of equipment. But there were no tire marks, no footprints, nothing usual. It made no sense. I tried not to think about it too much. Farms always had strange marks, strange smells, strange noises. That's normal for old rural land. At least that's what I told myself. That evening I went back to my tent early. The sky turned gray, and a cold wind pulled through the grass. I zipped myself inside and tried to read, but I kept hearing sounds in the distance. Not animals, not the wind, something slower, a steady rhythm, like steps. But whenever I paused and listened carefully, the noise stopped. Then, 5 or 10 minutes later, the pattern returned, faint and distant, but constant enough to feel wrong. I tried to ignore it and eventually fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. Not from a dream, my body just reacted. My eyes opened wide in the darkness. I didn't move. For a moment, I didn't even breathe. There was a noise outside my tent. A slow dragging sound across the dry grass, like something heavy was being pulled along the ground. It came from the direction of the broken fence. It wasn't fast or rushed. It was steady and deliberate, like whoever or whatever was making the sound wasn't in a hurry. I lay completely still, listening. The dragging grew louder, then stopped before reaching my tent. The silence afterward felt thicker than the dark. My chest tightened. I waited for what felt like hours, though it was probably just a few minutes. Finally, the sound returned, this time moving away. I didn't sleep again until the sky turned pale. When morning came, the whole field looked normal. Nothing seemed touched, nothing broken, nothing dragged. I checked the area where I heard the noise, expecting to see marks in the grass, but there was nothing. The wind blew lightly across the field, brushing everything clean. I tried to tell myself I imagined the whole thing, but the feeling in my stomach didn't believe that. That day, I kept closer to my tent. I didn't go far into the fields or near the tree line. I stayed where I could see everything around me. Around noon, I noticed something near the broken fence. A piece of cloth caught on a nail. It wasn't mine. It was dark gray, torn at one end, like it had been ripped off from someone's clothing. It swayed quietly in the breeze. When I reached out and touched it, I felt how stiff and dirty it was, like it had been dragged through the ground. The rest of the day passed slowly. Clouds built up in the sky, darker and heavier, turning everything underneath into a dull, flat shade. I felt like the whole farm was watching me. I tried to stay rational. Cloth on a fence wasn't strange. Old farms collect scraps, bits of clothing, pieces of fabric. People lose things all the time, but the dragging sound from last night kept circling my thoughts. That night, I didn't sleep early. I kept my lantern on and sat inside my tent listening to the wind. Hours went by. I tried to stay awake, but eventually my eyes grew heavy. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke again. This time the sound wasn't dragging. It was footsteps, slow, heavy steps in the grass, maybe 20 or 30 meters away. They weren't wandering. They were coming straight toward my tent. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The steps stopped just far enough that I couldn't see anything through the tent fabric, but close enough that I felt the presence of someone standing there. Then the steps turned, moving along the fence, then away toward the deeper parts of the field. They didn't rush. Whoever was walking wasn't scared or lost. They knew where they were going. I didn't sleep again. When the first light broke, I unzipped my tent slowly and looked outside. The grass had been disturbed, not trampled, just pressed in a thin line leading from the fence to the distant field. I followed it carefully, keeping my distance, moving slowly so I wouldn't make noise. The line led almost to the same area I had seen the flattened grass the day before. And right there, in the center of that circle, the grass was flattened again. Fresh. The spot was darker this time, wet, even though the air was dry. I crouched down and touched it. My fingers came up slightly stained. A cold feeling crawled up my spine. I realized then that I didn't want to know the rest. I didn't want answers or explanations. Something or someone had been using that spot at night. Something had been walking the fields, dragging something through the grass, moving close to my tent without fear. I packed my things quickly. My hands shook, but I tried to keep myself calm. I didn't run, but every step toward the dirt road felt like I was pulling myself out of deep water. The field behind me looked empty, too empty, like it was waiting for me to stop and look back. I didn't. When I reached the main road, I finally breathed normally again. My shirt was damp with sweat, even though the air was cold. I kept walking until I reached the small bus stop that led back into town. I didn't look in the direction of the farm. I didn't want to think about who or what had been walking out there at night, pulling something through the grass, standing close enough to my tent that I could almost feel it. To this day, I don't know what was happening on that farm. I didn't report anything. I didn't call anyone. I didn't want to explain something I couldn't fully understand. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw in the grass. And I know that someone else was out there in those fields at night, long after any normal person should be awake. I never went camping alone again after that. Not on farms, not in forests, not anywhere open and quiet. Silence doesn't feel peaceful to me anymore. It feels like the moment before something steps out of the dark, slow and heavy, dragging something behind it, crossing the field straight toward me. And the worst part is that I didn't see anything. I didn't hear a voice. I didn't get answers. All I got was a feeling that the farm wasn't as empty as it looked, that someone used those fields for something they didn't want anyone noticing. And one quiet night, I came too close. I still think about that week in the Austrian countryside, even though it has been years. It was the summer of 2014, and I was 26 at the time, too confident for my own good, too stubborn to admit that camping alone in a foreign country was not the smartest idea. I had been traveling through Europe for almost a month, moving from crowded cities into quieter landscapes. I wanted silence for a while, something that wasn't made of traffic and subway noise. That was why I picked a small valley near Spittal and Poetcharin, a place that looked peaceful in every photo I saw online. The hills looked soft, the trees thick and old, and there was a stream that ran through the middle of the valley like a silver line. It seemed perfect for a few days away from people. I arrived early in the morning after a long bus ride that twisted through the mountains. The air felt cleaner than anything I'd breathed in a long time, and the sky was bright with that sharp blue you get at high altitudes. I walked for almost an hour along a narrow trail until I found a flat area near the water. It wasn't an official campsite, but there were signs that other people had stayed there before. Burnt logs, smashed beer cans, and flattened grass told their own stories. I set up my tent near a fallen tree, making sure it was sheltered from the wind. I felt proud of myself for knowing what I was doing. Back then, I thought danger was something that only happened in news articles. The first day passed calmly. I explored the nearby woods, took pictures of wildflowers, listened to the stream moving over rocks. I ate simple food and watched the sun drop behind the ridge. The valley grew colder and quieter. When darkness settled, I sat outside my tent for a while, listening to insects buzzing in the grass. Everything felt normal, completely normal. The second day was when things began to feel wrong. Started small. I noticed footprints near the stream, prints that were fresh and deep in the mud, larger than mine, spaced wider apart. They were heading in the direction of my tent, but then curved away at the last moment. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a hiker, maybe someone who passed by early in the morning. But the prints didn't look like someone casually walking. They looked like someone trying to move quietly. Still, I tried to shake it off. I went for another hike, following a different path deeper into the valley. It was a long walk, about 3 hours round trip. When I got back, the first thing I noticed was the position of my backpack. I always kept it inside the tent, leaning against the right side. Now it was on the left side. Not thrown, not dumped, just moved, as if someone had picked it up, inspected it, and set it down in a different spot. Nothing was missing, and nothing else was disturbed, but the sight of it made something cold move through me. I didn't sleep well that night. The wind scraped against the tent, and every rustle from the trees made me open my eyes. I kept telling myself that I was overreacting. I was alone in the middle of nature. Of course there were sounds. Of course the wind would move things around. But around 2 in the morning, I heard something that wasn't the wind. It was slow, steady, and heavy. Footsteps, one after another, moving through the grass outside the tent. Not running, not wandering, walking with purpose, like someone trying not to make noise but failing because the ground was uneven. I lay completely still. My heart was beating so loud I felt like it filled the tent. The footsteps stopped close enough that whoever it was had to be standing just a few feet away from where I lay. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After what felt like forever, the steps slowly moved away. I waited almost an hour before I even sat up. It felt like the air inside the tent weighed 100 pounds. When daylight returned, I stepped outside and looked around carefully. The grass was flattened in a narrow path leading toward the trees. Someone had been there. Someone had watched the tent in the dark. By midday, my nerves were shot. I packed my things halfway, thinking I might leave early. But part of me didn't want to give up. It wasn't like anything had actually happened. A stranger walking by my tent wasn't a crime. Maybe it had been a lost hiker. Maybe someone exploring the valley. The rational explanations stacked up easily, but they felt hollow. I forced myself to stay one more night. I regret that decision more than almost anything else in my life. That evening, the temperature dropped suddenly. Dark clouds gathered over the ridgeline, and the wind carried a damp smell that warned of rain. I built a small fire and sat close to it, trying to stay warm. The woods seemed more crowded with shadows than the nights before. Every sound echoed a little too long. When the rain finally started, I crawled into my tent, zipped the entrance tightly, and wrapped myself in my sleeping bag. The rain grew heavier, a loud drumming on the thin fabric. It should have been a comforting sound, but it only made me feel more cut off from the world. Around midnight, the feeling of being watched hit me again. It was strange how strong it was. I couldn't hear anything at first, but my body seemed to sense something before my ears did. Then I caught it. The faint crunch of wet grass, slow and patient. Not from the path I had made, but from the opposite direction, where the ground dipped toward the woods. I stared at the fabric of my tent, waiting for a shadow, a shape, anything. Then I saw it. A tall figure standing just beyond the edge of the rain. Even through the fabric, I could see the outline clearly. The person wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. My throat went dry. I didn't speak. I didn't shout. I didn't even reach for anything. I froze like an animal caught in headlights. The figure stepped closer, slow and steady. I thought the tent would collapse from the sound of my heartbeat. The shadow leaned slightly, as if trying to listen for movement inside. The rain washed over everything, but this person kept standing there, soaked, unmoving. Minutes passed like hours. Then, without warning, the figure turned and walked into the trees. Not hurried, not panicked, just walked away, disappearing into the darkness like it was the most normal thing in the world. I didn't sleep after that. I sat upright until sunrise, every muscle locked tight. When the morning came, I packed everything in less than 10 minutes. My hands were shaking the entire time. I didn't bother checking the campsite. I didn't bother eating. I just left. The hike back to the road felt twice as long as it had before. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that tall figure somewhere behind me. But the forest stayed still, quiet in a way that felt almost staged. When I finally reached the road, I saw something that made me stop cold. On a patch of wet dirt near the edge of the trail, fresh footprints, the same size and shape as the ones I had seen near the stream on the second day. They were facing the direction I had just come from, as if someone had been standing there a short time before I arrived. I forced myself to keep walking, fast enough that my legs ached. When the bus arrived and I stepped inside, I felt the tightness in my chest finally ease. As the valley disappeared behind trees and bends in the road, the fear slowly drained, replaced by a heavy realization. Someone had been watching me for days. Not a lost hiker, not a random passerby. Someone who moved in silence, approached in the dark, studied my tent, inspected my things, and stood outside in the rain like it meant nothing. Someone who never tried to talk, never revealed a reason, never made a sound except for those steady footsteps. I never saw his face. I never learned who he was or what he wanted. But I knew one thing clearly by the time I reached the next town. Leaving when I did was the only reason nothing worse happened. I never camped alone again after that. And whenever I think about going back to Austria, I picture that silent figure in the rain, standing close enough to touch the thin wall of my tent. I picture the way he waited there, patient and calm, as if he had all the time in the world. And I remember that some places are beautiful in photos only because the danger in them never makes it into the frame. I was 31 when I decided to take a short hunting trip alone in the autumn of 2018. I had been working long weeks back to back, and the idea of quiet air and a slow campfire felt like something I needed more than anything. I chose a remote valley in northern Montana, far from towns, far from paved roads, and far from anything that looked familiar. I had been there once before with a friend years earlier, but this time I wanted the silence of going by myself. I packed light, just enough food for 3 days, my rifle, a small tent, and all the basics I thought would keep me warm and comfortable. I drove in late in the afternoon. The sky hung low with thick gray clouds, and the wind pushed dry leaves across the dirt path. The place looked different than I remembered. The trees felt taller. The brush felt thicker. Even the air had a colder bite to it. I followed a narrow track that ran between tall pines until it faded into nothing. Then I walked the last half mile by foot until I reached a small clearing near a shallow stream. The grass was flattened there in some places, as if animals had been moving through recently, but nothing looked threatening. It looked like a place that belonged to nature far more than it ever belonged to people. I set my tent near the tree line where the ground was level, and I gathered enough dry wood to keep a fire going through the evening. Once the fire was lit, the orange glow made everything feel calmer. The sound of the stream mixing with the fire crackling gave me a feeling of being away from everything stressful. I ate a small meal, checked my gear, and made notes about the wind direction and the terrain. I wanted to wake up before sunrise to start scouting for deer. The first night passed without anything worth noting. I heard a few distant snaps deeper in the timber, probably from elk or maybe just branches falling. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt unsafe. I slept well. The next morning, I woke in complete darkness. The cold had crept through my sleeping bag, and for a moment I just lay still, listening to the forest before moving. When the first thin line of pale blue daylight slid across the clearing, I stepped outside and stretched my legs. The air smelled like wet earth and pine sap. I grabbed my rifle and headed up a ridge not too far from camp, following tracks in the soft soil. They looked fresh, 2 deer, possibly a small group. The ground was still slightly damp from night frost, and I could see each hoof clearly. But as I followed them deeper into the woods, I noticed something else. A single print, much larger, pressed into a patch of mud near an uprooted log. It looked like a boot print, but the shape was odd. The heel was deeper than the front, and the toes pointed slightly inward. It didn't match any normal hiking boot I recognized. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it, trying to figure out how old it was. Maybe a day, maybe a few hours. It was hard to tell because the mud was firm but not frozen. I brushed it off as another hunter and continued on. By noon, I circled back to camp without spotting anything worth taking a shot at. The wind had picked up, and I decided to rest and wait for the evening. When I stepped back into camp, something felt different. My duffel bag was slightly shifted from where I left it. Not much, just a few inches. My cooking pot was turned upside down. My jacket, which I had left folded on a rock, lay on the ground with a small patch of dirt on it. I looked around for tracks, expecting to see signs of a curious animal, but the only prints I could find were mine. I told myself I must have moved the bag without remembering. Maybe I knocked the jacket off when leaving in the morning. I tried not to overthink it, even though something about it didn't sit right. The second night felt heavier. The wind made the trees sway and groan. The forest felt restless in a way I couldn't explain. I kept the fire burning brighter and longer than usual. Every now and then I thought I heard something moving in the distance, 2 slow steps, then nothing. I stayed awake longer than I planned, listening to every sound until the fire burned down to red coals and I finally crawled into the tent. I woke up sometime just after midnight. My heart was already beating fast before I understood why. I could hear something outside, moving through the brush with slow, uneven steps. It didn't sound like an animal. Animals move with purpose, with rhythm. This sounded like something unsure of itself, something placing each step carefully, testing the ground. The steps came closer. I lay completely still, barely breathing, waiting for the sound to fade. But it didn't fade. It stopped right outside my tent. I felt the air in my chest get tight. I waited for breathing, for growling, for some sign of what it was, but all I heard was silence. The zipper of the tent was inches from my face, and every part of me was aware of how thin the fabric was. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just waited. After several long seconds, the steps moved again. This time they moved around the back of the tent, slow and dragging. Something brushed against the corner of the tent, lightly, almost like fingertips. Then the sound drifted away into the trees, fading until I couldn't hear anything at all. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, gripping my rifle, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent. I told myself it had to be a person, maybe a lost hiker, maybe someone camping nearby. But no lost hiker walks silently around another person's tent in the middle of the night without saying anything. And no regular camper moves like that, slow and uneven with long pauses. As soon as the sky brightened, I stepped outside. The ground around the tent told the story clearly. There were prints, several of them. They weren't from boots. They looked more like old shoes with worn soles, the kind with barely any tread left. The toes pointed inward just like the one print I had seen earlier near the ridge. I looked around and scanned the tree line, but nothing moved. Everything looked normal, almost peaceful. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me long before I noticed. I made up my mind to leave that day. I packed fast, faster than I ever had on any camping trip. As I loaded my gear, I found something near the fire pit that hadn't been there the night before. A small strip of cloth, dark brown, almost black, caught on a branch. It smelled like old sweat and dirt. I didn't touch it for long. I tossed it aside and kept packing. As I walked back toward where I'd parked, I kept looking behind me. Every few minutes I thought I heard something. A twig snapping far off, a faint shuffle of movement. But every time I stopped to listen, the forest went silent again. I moved faster, almost jogging by the time I reached the tree line where my truck was hidden. When I finally saw my vehicle, I felt a wave of relief. But that relief faded the moment I noticed the thin smear of dirt on the passenger door, right near the handle, as if someone had touched it recently. The dirt was still fresh, not dried, not cracked. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine without wasting a second. As I drove away, the trees closed in behind me, and the clearing disappeared from sight. When I reached the highway, the world suddenly felt normal again. Cars passed by, the sky opened up, and the air felt less heavy. But even now, years later, I still remember the way those footsteps sounded on the cold ground. Slow, careful, watching. I never went back to that valley. I never even tried. And the one thing that has stayed with me more than anything is this. Whoever was out there was not lost, was not curious, and was not confused. Whoever was out there knew I was alone, knew where I slept, and moved through the dark like they had done it many times before. Leaving when I did was the best choice I made, because whoever circled my tent that night wasn't passing by. They were waiting for something, and I'm still glad I never stayed long enough to find out what. I went camping alone in the early autumn of 2019, in a quiet part of northern Idaho, a place where the woods looked almost untouched and the air felt colder than it should have been for that time of year. I was 24 then, and I thought I understood the outdoors well enough to handle a weekend on my own. I had hiked in different places before, slept in my tent during storms, carried my own gear for long distances, and handled long nights with no one around. None of that prepared me for how it felt to be watched by something real and human, something I couldn't explain away with stories or imagination. I picked a small clearing beside a narrow stream. The water was low and moved slowly between dark rocks. The clearing was flat, and I could see just enough sky through the tall pines to track the light during the day. I liked camping spots like that because they made me feel settled. The forest floor was soft with dry needles, and the whole place smelled like cold dirt and sap. I reached the spot late in the afternoon. The air was cooling fast, the kind of cold that makes your fingers sting when you touch metal. I unpacked my gear slowly, stacking everything in neat piles because I didn't want anything misplaced later. There was no one on the trail when I hiked in, and I didn't see any signs of other campers. The ground didn't show any fresh footprints or tire marks from anyone dragging equipment. Even the fire pit looked old, filled with gray dust and broken bits of charcoal that had been rained on many times. I set up my tent facing the trees so the morning light would hit it first. I hung my food in a sack between two trees, higher than my head, just to keep animals away. I ate early, heating a small meal on my camp stove. The woods were quiet except for the faint trickle of the stream and the wind brushing through the pine branches above me. The quiet didn't bother me at first. I usually liked when the woods fell silent before sunset. It made me feel like I was far from everything that made life noisy. I moved around the clearing a lot just to stay warm as the sun dropped behind the trees. The temperature fell fast. The kind of fast where the cold feels like it bites through your clothes even when you're wearing layers. I kept adjusting my jacket zipper and rubbing my hands together. When the light faded, the shadows between the trees looked heavy and thick, as if they were pressing toward the clearing. I kept telling myself it was just the early darkness and the cold making me nervous. When night settled, I climbed into my tent. The fabric made soft sounds when I shifted, and the floor felt colder than I expected. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, pulled the hood tight around my neck, and tried to relax. The air smelled like damp nylon and pine sap stuck on my clothes. For a while, I just listened to the normal night sounds. Branches moving, the faint water sounds from the stream, the tiny tapping of loose needles dropping onto the tent. Around midnight, something changed. It started subtly, nothing sharp or sudden, just a sense that the woods outside had gone still in a way that wasn't normal. The wind stopped completely. The stream sounded softer, almost like it was being muffled by something. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath. I shifted inside my sleeping bag, and the sound of the fabric felt loud in the silence. Then I heard footsteps. They were slow and heavy, not the light, quick sound of a deer or the stumbling noise of raccoons. These steps were deliberate, one at a time, pressing down onto the forest floor with weight. They came from somewhere behind my tent, maybe 10 or 12 meters away. They stopped sometimes, then started again. I could hear the pine needles crushing under each step. I held my breath for a long time, listening hard. The footsteps moved around the clearing, not close enough to touch the tent, but close enough that I could hear the earth shifting. The steps circled wide, almost like someone was walking at the edge of my camping area but avoiding the center. I kept trying to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a big elk, maybe a black bear, something that had wandered too close. But the pattern of the steps didn't match an animal. There was no sniffing, no random moving, no sudden pauses like animals do. Felt too cautious, too aware. The steps stopped again, this time directly behind my food bag. I waited for the sound of something pulling at it or brushing against the rope, but nothing happened. Just silence, thick and cold. I stayed inside the tent for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Eventually, the steps faded into the trees. I listened hard for a long time and didn't hear anything else. The forest stayed unnaturally quiet, and I couldn't fall asleep again. I just lay there, staring upward even though I couldn't see anything in the darkness of the tent. When the first light of morning touched the fabric of the tent, I unzipped it and stepped outside. The air was freezing and smelled sharp, like wet metal. The clearing looked the same, but the ground didn't. The pine needles around the edge of the area had been disturbed. I could see large footprints, not animal prints. The soil there was soft enough to show the outline of a shoe. I followed the tracks only for a few steps before stopping. They came from deeper in the woods, walked in a half circle around the clearing, and left in a different direction. They weren't mine. The ground near my tent entrance still showed my own footprints from the night before. These prints were wider, heavier, spaced farther apart. Someone had walked around my camp while I slept. My food bag hadn't been touched, and nothing was missing, but the prints alone were enough to make my chest tighten. The idea that someone had walked around my camp without saying anything, without making themselves known, felt worse than any wild animal could have. I spent a long time standing there in the cold air, staring at the prints and the dark line of trees where the steps had come from. The forest looked almost too dense, like whoever it was still standing behind some tree, watching. I kept scanning the tree line, expecting to see movement, but there was nothing. I didn't even eat breakfast. I packed everything as fast as I could, forcing my hands to work even though they felt stiff from the cold and fear. Every few seconds, I looked over my shoulder. The sense of being watched stayed the entire time, like a pressure on the back of my neck. When I finally started hiking out, the woods felt different than they had when I arrived. Every crack of a branch made me tense. Every shift of wind in the trees sounded like someone stepping through them. The trail felt narrower, and the shadows felt darker, like the daylight wasn't strong enough to push them back. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My legs were shaking, partly from the cold, partly from how fast I had walked. When I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror even though I knew no one was behind me. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles hurt. For days after I got home, I kept thinking about those footsteps. They weren't random. They weren't curious animal movements. They were human. Someone had walked quietly around my tent at midnight in the middle of nowhere, without saying a word, without touching anything, without leaving any sign except the prints in the soft ground. I still camp sometimes, but never alone. And I never stay in places where the woods fall too quiet. That night in 2019 taught me something I didn't want to learn. The scariest thing in the forest isn't the wildlife, or the dark, or any imagined creature. It's the people who move quietly, who watch without speaking, who walk around your camp in the middle of the night for reasons you never get to understand. That night didn't end with anything dramatic. I didn't get attacked, I didn't see the person, and nothing was stolen. But the fear stayed because the danger was real and silent. And the truth became clear only afterward, when I kept thinking about those slow, heavy footsteps circling me while I slept. That was enough to change the way I see camping forever, because I realized that sometimes nothing happening is the scariest ending of all, because it means someone was out there, and you never learned why. I had planned the trip for months, mapping out a remote section of the Cascade Mountains in Washington. It was the summer of 2018, and I had just turned 26. I needed a break from work, the constant hum of the city, and the mess of life that seemed to follow me everywhere. I drove my old Jeep deep into the mountains, past the last gas station and the final cluster of homes, until the pavement gave way to gravel and the air felt cleaner, colder, and heavier with pine. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing near a creek. The trees arched overhead, forming a natural cathedral of green. I parked, unloaded my gear, and set up my tent. I was alone, which I preferred. I had my sleeping bag, a small stove, a headlamp, and a backpack filled with food and water. I even brought a basic first aid kit just in case. The creek gurgled nearby, the only sound besides the occasional bird call. At first, everything felt perfect. I wandered along the trail, snapped photos of moss-covered rocks, and made notes about the wildlife tracks I found along the banks. As the sun began to dip, golden light spilling across the trees, I started a small fire, just enough to boil water for dinner. The sky darkened quickly in the mountains, and soon the stars were sharp and bright, piercing the black sky. I felt a kind of peaceful isolation I had never known. Around 10, I crawled into my tent, zippered it shut, and tried to sleep. The air was cooler than I expected, and the creek's constant murmur was soothing at first. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing odd sounds in the woods, the snap of a twig, rustling leaves, and something heavier, like boots crunching on gravel. I dismissed it as wildlife. Bears and deer were common here, and I had read enough survival guides to know that most animals would avoid humans if given the chance. About an hour later, the sounds stopped. The woods went quiet again, except for the creek. I drifted off, exhausted. I woke suddenly to a noise outside. My heart jumped. It sounded like something or someone was moving deliberately toward my tent. Heavy steps, not animalistic. My first thought was a hiker, maybe lost or careless. But the trail I had come in on was at least a mile away, and there was no light. I sat up and listened. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a zipper being slowly drawn. My tent flapped slightly in the wind, or was it? My breath caught and my hands shook. I grabbed the small pocket knife I kept in my sleeping bag. The sound stopped, replaced by silence so thick it felt like it pressed against my eardrums. I realized I wasn't just afraid of someone outside. I was terrified that I couldn't see them. My flashlight was in the tent, but if I shined it outside, whoever it was would know I was awake. I decided to stay silent and still, hoping whoever it was would move on. Minutes stretched. Then I heard a low whistle, deliberate and slow, almost like a signal. My stomach nodded. Whoever was out there wasn't a random hiker. This felt intentional. My mind raced. I didn't have a gun, just a knife, a flare in my pack, and the fire that had long since burned down to embers. I tried to remember what I knew about self-defense in the woods. Stay calm. Don't make sudden moves. Make yourself look big. Stay aware. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I strained to hear anything. Branches breaking, the sound of a boot, a shadow passing behind the trees. I could feel the presence, a slow, creeping movement around the perimeter of my camp. Suddenly, a stone hit the tent. I jumped, my heart hammering, and it bounced off the fabric, landing near my feet. Whoever it was testing me, seeing if I was awake. I could smell smoke faintly from the fire, and it gave me a small, fleeting sense of control. I could at least see my immediate area. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicked it on, and shone it outside. Nothing. The clearing was empty, but the shadows seemed too dark, too still. Then, a movement at the edge of the clearing. Someone crouched near the tree line, watching. My first instinct was to scream, but I forced myself to stay quiet. The figure didn't run. It just observed. I knew I had to act. I grabbed my pack, stuffed my knife in my pocket, and quietly unzipped the back of the tent. If I ran to my Jeep, I had a chance. I waited for a moment, counted to 3 in my head, and bolted toward the vehicle, adrenaline surging through my body. I didn't look back. Branches slapped my face and arms. Roots snagged my feet, and I almost fell several times. When I reached the Jeep, I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with sweat. The headlights pierced the darkness as I slammed the door and locked it. I started the engine, and the figure at the edge of the clearing froze for a moment, then disappeared into the trees. I didn't stop driving until I reached a small town half an hour later. My heart was still racing, my hands shaking on the wheel. I pulled into a motel and stayed there the night, too jittery to sleep. The next morning, I called the local ranger station. I reported the incident, gave them a description of what I had seen. A man, mid-30s, wearing dark clothing, moving deliberately through the woods near a remote camping area. They told me they had received similar reports from hikers over the past few weeks and that local police had been patrolling more often. Apparently, there had been break-ins at campsites, and authorities suspected someone was watching campsites for easy targets. I had been lucky. My tent was visible, but I had a vehicle nearby and moved fast. After that trip, I stopped going to remote spots alone. I started camping in busier areas or with friends. The memory never left me. The feeling of being watched, the silent movement outside my tent, the stone hitting the fabric. I couldn't shake the idea that if I had reacted differently or hesitated, it could have ended much worse. I went back to that section of the Cascades a few years later, but I never stayed overnight. I drove through the same winding roads, past the same gravel trails, and peered at the clearing near the creek. It looked peaceful in daylight the way nature often does. But I knew better. I knew someone had been there, waiting, observing, and I had been lucky to escape. The experience changed the way I approached wilderness trips. I started carrying a firearm for protection, extra flashlights, motion sensing alarms, and always let someone know exactly where I was going. I learned to trust my instincts, to pay attention to the small signs, the subtle shift in shadows, the barely audible sound of footsteps that weren't mine. That night taught me that the wilderness is unpredictable, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of people. And people can be far scarier than anything else you might encounter in the woods.